England, 1849. The iron gates groaned as they parted, a sound that echoed through the misty morning like a warning. Evander Draymore, Duke of Blackridge, sat atop his midnight stallion and surveyed the estate before him, with eyes as cold and grey as winter steel. The Vale property stretched before him in neglected grandeur, its once manicured gardens now wild with autumn's decay, its stone walls darkened by time and sorrow. He had postponed this reckoning long enough. 3 years. 3 years since Thomas Vale had breathed his last, and still the debt remained unpaid. £20,000, a fortune that would cripple most men, owed not through gambling or folly, but through something far more sinister. Evander's jaw tightened as he urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves crunching against the gravel drive. The world knew him as ruthless, and perhaps they were right. But they didn't know what Thomas Vale had done. They didn't know the betrayal that had carved itself into Evander's soul like a blade seeking bone. The house loomed larger as he approached, a Georgian manor that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the window frames, and several shutters hung askew. Yet there was something defiant in its stance, a dignity that refused to bow even as decay crept along its foundations. Much like its current mistress, he imagined. The widow Vale had written him exactly 3 letters in as many years, each one more desperate than the last, begging for time, for mercy, for understanding. He had granted none of it. Evander dismounted with fluid grace, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the entrance as a servant materialized to take his horse. The man was elderly, his livery threadbare but clean, his eyes downcast as though he feared looking upon the Duke of Blackridge might turn him to stone. The rumors, it seemed, had preceded him. "Announce me," Evander commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came as naturally to him as breathing. He removed his riding gloves with deliberate precision, black leather against pale skin scarred along the knuckles from a past he rarely revisited. The servant disappeared into the dim interior, and Evander stood alone in the entrance hall, taking in the faded grandeur surrounding him. A portrait hung above the mantelpiece, and despite himself his gaze was drawn to it. Thomas Vale stared back at him, painted in his prime, with that calculating smile Evander remembered too well. The man who had promised partnership and delivered destruction. The man whose actions had cost Evander nearly everything. And beside Thomas in the painting sat a woman, her face turned slightly away, as though she wished to escape the canvas itself. Young, delicate, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold some secret sorrow even then. "Your Grace." The voice came from behind him, soft but steady, and Evander turned to find the woman from the portrait made flesh. Lysandra Vale stood in the doorway with her hands clasped before her, her bearing straight despite the weight of widowhood and poverty that must surely press upon her shoulders. She wore black, as was proper, but the gown was several seasons old, carefully mended at the cuffs. Her dark hair was swept back in a simple style that revealed the elegant line of her neck, and her eyes, those eyes that had seemed sorrowful in paint, met his with unexpected courage. "Mrs. Vale." He bowed with the bare minimum of courtesy required by his station. "I trust you received word of my arrival." "I did not." Her voice remained calm, though he detected the faintest tremor beneath its surface. "Though I cannot say I am surprised. You have been patient far longer than expected, Your Grace." "Patient is not a word many would use to describe me." "No," she agreed, and something flickered in her expression. Was it amusement? "I imagine they use considerably darker adjectives." This caught him off guard. He had expected tears, perhaps defiance, certainly not this quiet acknowledgement of his reputation. The women of the ton typically simpered or shrank in his presence, performing elaborate dances of flirtation or fear. Lysandra Vale did neither. She simply stood there waiting, her eyes never leaving his face. "Shall we speak in the drawing room?" she asked when he offered no response. "I can have tea brought, though I'm afraid our hospitality has become rather modest." "This is not a social call." "I am aware, Your Grace. Nevertheless, the conversation we must have deserves better than a drafty entrance hall." Without waiting for his agreement, she turned and led him down a corridor lined with more portraits, these of Vale ancestors going back generations. Each face seemed to watch him with accusation, or perhaps warning. The drawing room she ushered him into was shabby genteel, its furniture fine but worn, its curtains heavy but faded by too many summers of sun. A small fire burned in the grate, barely adequate against the autumn chill that permeated the house. Lysandra moved to a small desk in the corner and retrieved a leather portfolio, her movements graceful despite the obvious wear of her circumstances. She placed it on the table between them and then, finally, took a seat. She did not offer him one, and he found himself respecting this small assertion of authority in her own domain. He remained standing, a position of power he had learned to wield as effectively as any weapon. "The debt," she began without preamble, "is £20,000. I am aware of this. I am also aware that the interest you might rightfully claim would bring that sum to nearly 30,000 by now. I do not have it, Your Grace. I do not have even a fraction of it." "Then we have nothing to discuss." "On the contrary, we have everything to discuss." She opened the portfolio, revealing papers covered in neat handwriting. "Before we proceed to whatever arrangement you intend, seizure of property, debtor's prison, or simply ruining what remains of the Vale name, I would ask you to tell me something." "I am not here to answer your questions, madam." "Why did my husband owe you this money?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Evander's expression hardened, every line of his face becoming granite. "You know why. He borrowed it for a business venture that failed. That is what his letters said. That is what his solicitor told me after his death, but it isn't true, is it, Your Grace?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. "I spent 3 years going through every document in this house, every ledger, every letter, every scrap of correspondence. There was no business venture, no investment that went wrong, nothing that would explain why a man who had never borrowed so much as a shilling in his life would suddenly acquire a debt of such magnitude." Evander felt something cold settle in his chest. She was clever, this widow. Too clever, perhaps. What your husband chose to tell you or conceal from you is no concern of mine. It is if that debt is built on lies. "Are you suggesting I would fabricate a debt?" His voice dropped to a dangerous softness that had made stronger men pale. But Lysandra Vale did not pale. She met his gaze steadily, though her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the portfolio. "I am suggesting that whatever arrangement you and Thomas had, it was not what either of you claimed it to be. And before I surrender everything, this house, my future, my very survival, I deserve to know the truth of what I'm surrendering it for." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The fire crackled. Outside, a bird called, lonely and distant. Evander found himself studying her face, really looking at her for the first time. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, not with those sharp cheekbones and that too direct gaze. But there was something compelling in her features, a strength that drew the eye and held it. This was not the frightened widow he had expected to find. This was someone who had been forged by suffering into something harder, more resilient. "The debt is real," he said finally. "Whether you understand its origins or not does not change that fact. Then help me understand." "Why should I?" "Because despite what you may believe, Your Grace, I am not your enemy. I am merely the person left behind when the real players in whatever game you and Thomas were engaged in removed themselves from the board, one through death, the other through silence." She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the overgrown gardens. "I was 18 when I married Thomas Vale. He was 42. I had no fortune, no connections, nothing to recommend me but a respectable name and a face he apparently found pleasing enough. My father had debts of his own, and Thomas offered to settle them in exchange for my hand. I agreed because I had 2 younger sisters who would have suffered if I refused." Evander listened despite himself, uncomfortable with the raw honesty in her voice. "For 7 years, I was a dutiful wife. I managed his household, entertained his guests, asked no questions about his business affairs. When he died, I thought perhaps I might finally have some measure of peace, some small portion of independence. Instead, I discovered I had inherited nothing but mysteries and debts. Your debt, specifically." She turned to face him again, and he saw the shadows beneath her eyes, the weariness she carried like a physical weight. "So I ask you again, Your Grace, Why did my husband owe you £20,000? He should leave. He should take his satisfaction in her fear, in the knowledge that she could not pay, and begin the legal proceedings that would strip away everything she had left. That was why he had come, after all. To collect, to punish, to exact some measure of justice for what Thomas Vale had taken from him. But instead, he found himself speaking. Your husband made me a promise. He broke it. The debt is compensation for that breach. What promise? That is none of your concern. Everything about this is my concern. The first real emotion broke through her careful composure, her voice rising. Do you think I want to beg you for mercy? Do you think I enjoy standing here in this house that is falling apart around me, wearing a dress I have mended a dozen times, knowing that the servants I can barely afford to keep might not be paid next month? I am drowning, Your Grace, and you refuse to tell me why the water is rising. Her passion surprised him, stirred something he had thought long dead. Your husband destroyed someone I cared for. The debt is his punishment, extended now to you. Lysandra's face went very still. Destroyed how? That is all you need to know. It isn't. She crossed the room toward him, close enough now that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her dress. If Thomas destroyed someone you cared for, then your quarrel was with him, not with me. I never hurt you, Your Grace. I never even knew you existed until after my husband's death. Yet you would take your revenge on me for his sins? You are his widow. You bear his name. You benefit from whatever fortune he left you. What fortune? She laughed, a bitter sound. Look around you. Does this look like the home of someone who benefited from her husband's dealings? Thomas left me nothing but debt and suspicion. The Ton whispers that he killed himself. Did you know that? They say he couldn't bear the shame of whatever he had done. Others claim it was an accident, that he simply fell from his horse during one of his late-night rides. But no one knows for certain because no one was there. He rode out one evening and never came back. They found him the next morning, his neck broken, his horse standing guard over his body. Evander felt his breath catch. Suicide? Perhaps, perhaps not. He left no note, no explanation, just me and silence, and the wreckage of whatever life he had been living in secret. She moved away from him, wrapping her arms around herself as though cold. So if you have come for revenge, Your Grace, you are 3 years too late. Thomas is beyond your reach now. I am merely the ghost he left behind. Something shifted in the room. In him. He had spent years nursing his hatred for Thomas Vale, building it into a fortress around his heart. But looking at this woman who had suffered as much as he had, perhaps more, he felt the foundations of that fortress begin to crack. My sister, he said quietly, the words dragged from some deep place he rarely accessed. Thomas Vale destroyed my sister. Lysandra turned to him, her expression shifting from defiance to something softer. Tell me. And so he did. Not because he wanted to, not because he thought it would change anything, but because suddenly the weight of carrying the story alone felt unbearable. He told her about Catherine, his younger sister by 5 years, brilliant and beautiful and beloved, how she had met Thomas Vale at a house party, how he had courted her with promises and charm, how Evander had been away on business when Thomas had seduced her with talk of elopement and eternal devotion. He never intended to marry her, Evander said, his voice rough with old pain. He simply wanted what all men like him want, conquest, possession, the thrill of ruining something pure. When she realized he had been lying, when she understood that there would be no marriage, no future, he paused, forcing the next words out. She took laudanum, nearly enough to kill herself. We saved her, but the scandal destroyed her. She was sent away to live with distant relatives in Scotland. She writes to me rarely now, formal letters that tell me nothing of her happiness or lack thereof. I'm sorry, Lysandra whispered, and he could hear the genuine sorrow in her voice. Truly, I am so sorry. Your sorrow changes nothing. No, she agreed. But perhaps understanding does. Thomas was capable of terrible things, Your Grace. I learned that long before his death. The man I married revealed himself slowly, and what I discovered beneath the polished surface was... She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Dark, cruel, in ways both subtle and overt. I do not ask you to forgive him. but I ask you to understand that I was as much his victim as your sister was." Evander wanted to reject this comparison to maintain the clarity of his rage, but looking at Lysandra Vale, at the quiet dignity with which she bore her suffering, he found he could not. "What would you have me do?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "The debt exists. I cannot simply forgive it." "I don't ask you to forgive it. I ask you for time to understand it. Give me access to Thomas's papers from his time in London, his correspondence with you, anything that might explain what truly happened between you. Let me help you find whatever justice you seek, if justice can still be found. And in exchange, give me time to settle what can be settled. This house is worth something, surely. I have jewelry, though most of it is paste now. I have—" She faltered, her composure finally cracking. "I have so little, Your Grace, but what I have, I will give you. Just please, don't take everything today." He should refuse. He should do what he came to do, take what was owed, leave her to whatever fate awaited, and return to London with the satisfaction of a debt collected. But something in her plea, in the desperate hope that still lived in her eyes despite everything, made him pause. "1 month," he heard himself say. "I will give you 1 month to search through whatever papers remain. If you find anything that changes the nature of the debt, we will discuss it. If not, I will proceed with seizing the property and whatever else is necessary to satisfy what is owed." Relief flooded her face, so profound it almost hurt to witness. "Thank you, Your Grace. I promise I will—" "Do not thank me yet, Mrs. Vale. I am not known for my mercy, and this may prove to be merely a postponement of the inevitable." He moved toward the door, needing suddenly to be away from her, from this house, from the uncomfortable feeling that was settling in his chest. "I will return in a fortnight to assess your progress. If I find you have used this time to hide assets or flee, the consequences will be severe." "I have nowhere to run," she said simply. "This house is all I have left." He nodded curtly and strode from the room down the corridor past those watching portraits, out into the grey morning where his horse waited. Only when he was mounted, and the Vale estate was disappearing behind him, did he allow himself to acknowledge the truth. He had not expected to feel anything for Thomas Vale's widow. He had certainly not expected to feel sympathy, and he most definitely had not expected the way his pulse had quickened when she stood close to him, or the strange reluctance he had felt in leaving. This was dangerous, he told himself, as he urged his horse into a gallop. This was a complication he could not afford. He had come to collect a debt, not to become entangled with the woman who bore the debtor's name. Yet even as he tried to summon back his anger, his certainty, he found it slipping through his fingers like water. Lysandra Vale had done something he had thought impossible. She had made him question the righteousness of his revenge. Behind him, in the drawing room of the deteriorating estate, Lysandra sank into her chair and allowed herself to shake. She had gambled everything on that conversation, on her ability to appeal to whatever humanity might still exist beneath the Duke of Blackridge's fearsome reputation. 1 month. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had dared hope for. Rising, she returned to the portfolio she had shown him, pulling out the papers she had not revealed. Letters, documents, ledgers, all encrypted in a code she had been slowly unraveling. Thomas had been meticulous in his secrets, but death had made him careless, or perhaps he had wanted someone to find these eventually, to understand what he had done and why. She traced her finger over one letter in particular, dated shortly before his death, the words partially decoded revealing names and amounts that made her blood run cold. The Duke of Blackridge had come seeking payment for a debt, but Lysandra suspected the true debt was something else entirely, something that had cost multiple people their innocence, their peace, perhaps even their lives. And if she could decode these papers, if she could understand what Thomas had truly been involved in, perhaps she could give the Duke something more valuable than money. Perhaps she could give him truth. She worked through the night, candles burning low as she matched letters to numbers, patterns to meanings, slowly revealing the hidden narrative beneath the innocuous-seeming correspondence. Thomas had been involved in something vast and corrupt, a scheme that had ensnared multiple noble houses, the Duke of Blackridge's among them. Money had changed hands. Promises had been made and broken, and somewhere in the middle of it all, people like Catherine Draymore had been sacrificed as collateral damage. When dawn broke, Lysandra's eyes burned and her hand cramped, but she had decoded enough to understand the shape of the conspiracy. Thomas had not acted alone. There were others, men of power and influence, who had conspired to manipulate investments, ruin competitors, and cover their tracks with bribes and blackmail. The £20,000 the Duke claimed was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and Thomas's death, whether suicide or accident, had perhaps been more convenient than anyone realized. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Lysandra worked through the documents by night, managing her dwindling household by day. The servants grew curious about her late hours, the way she would emerge from Thomas's old study with ink-stained fingers and shadows under her eyes. But she said nothing, trusting no one with what she was discovering. The conspiracy Thomas had been part of was too dangerous, its tentacles reaching too far into powerful circles. On the 8th day, a carriage appeared on the drive. Lysandra watched from her window as the Duke of Blackridge emerged, early for his promised fortnight visit. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall, imposing, his face set in lines that suggested he smiled rarely and meant it even less. But she noticed things she had not before, the way he moved with unconscious grace, the intelligence that shone in his grey eyes, the sense of controlled power that radiated from him like heat from a forge. She met him in the drawing room again, this time prepared with tea despite his protests that this was not a social call. "If we are to have a civil discussion, Your Grace, we will do it with some measure of civility," she said firmly, pouring without waiting for his assent. He accepted the cup with what might have been the ghost of amusement. "You are bolder than when we last met. Perhaps, or perhaps I simply have less to lose." She took her own seat, noting how his gaze travelled around the room, cataloguing the changes, fewer ornaments on the mantelpiece, spaces on the walls where paintings had hung. "I have begun selling what I can. Small pieces that won't be missed. It won't amount to even a fraction of what is owed, but I wanted you to see that I am trying." That was not our agreement. No. Our agreement was that I would search Thomas's papers. I have. I've found... She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "I've found things that may explain why Thomas owed you money, but also things that complicate that debt considerably." Interest sharpened his features. "Show me." She retrieved the papers she had prepared, selecting carefully what to reveal. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to demonstrate that Thomas's debt was part of something larger. She showed him ledgers that recorded payments to members of Parliament, correspondence that hinted at insider information being traded for profit, notations that suggested blackmail and coercion. Evander read through the documents with increasing tension, his jaw tightening until she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. When he finished, he looked up at her with eyes that burned. "Where did you find these?" "Hidden in the library, inside hollowed-out books. Thomas was paranoid about someone discovering his records, but not paranoid enough, apparently. Or perhaps he wanted them found eventually." She leaned forward. "Your Grace, the debt you claim, I believe it was payment for information. Information that Thomas was supposed to provide about your family's investments, your sister's movements, details that would allow whoever he was working with to manipulate situations to their advantage." "Catherine," he breathed, understanding dawning. He was gathering information about Catherine for someone else, someone who wanted to ruin her specifically, to hurt me through her. "I believe so, yes. And when you discovered what he was doing, you demanded compensation. £20,000, roughly equivalent to what you lost in the investments that failed because of the information he sold. How do you know about those failures?" "I found records. Thomas kept meticulous accounts of everything." She pulled out another document, this one showing a timeline of investments made and lost by various noble families, including the Draymores. He was being paid by someone to orchestrate these losses, but the papers don't say who. That part of the code I haven't been able to break. Evander stood abruptly, pacing to the window. She watched him struggle with this information, saw the way his hands clenched and relaxed at his sides. If this is true, if Thomas was working for someone else, Then killing him might not have been an accident at all. No, Lysandra agreed quietly. It might not have been. He turned to her, his expression fierce. You've put yourself in danger by decoding these papers. If whoever Thomas worked for discovers you have this information, then I'll be in no more danger than I already am. They've left me alone for 3 years. I suspect they believe I'm too ignorant or too frightened to look too deeply into my husband's affairs. She met his gaze steadily. But I am neither ignorant nor frightened anymore, Your Grace. I want to know who destroyed my life as much as you want to know who destroyed your sister's. We have a common enemy, it seems. The silence that followed was different from their previous encounters. There was an understanding building between them, tentative but real. Evander returned to his seat, and for the first time, she saw him look at her not as Thomas Vale's widow, but as a person in her own right. What do you propose? He asked. I propose we work together. I continue decoding the papers while you use your connections in London to investigate the names that appear in these documents. Between us, we might uncover who was truly behind Thomas's schemes, and when we do, she paused, then continued with quiet intensity, when we do, we make them pay. Not with money, but with justice, real justice. You want revenge. I want truth. If revenge follows, so be it. She held out her hand across the small table between them. Do we have an agreement, Your Grace? He looked at her hand for a long moment, and she wondered what he saw. The ink stains on her fingers, the calluses from working in her garden because she could no longer afford proper groundskeepers, the tremor she couldn't quite control. Then slowly he reached out and took her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through her. We have an agreement, Mrs. Vale, but understand this. If we pursue this path, there is no turning back. We will make dangerous enemies. Your life, such as it is, may become even more precarious. My life has been precarious since the day I married Thomas. At least now I'll understand why. She withdrew her hand, though she felt the ghost of his touch lingering on her skin. You may stay here while we work. The house has many empty rooms, and it would be more efficient than you riding back and forth from wherever you've been lodging. That would be inappropriate. So would allowing the Duke of Blackridge to stay at the local inn while he helps the widowed Mrs. Vale investigate her late husband's mysterious death. People will talk regardless. We might as well make it convenient for ourselves. She smiled slightly. Besides, my reputation is already in tatters. What's one more scandal? Despite himself, Evander felt his lips twitch. You are remarkably pragmatic for a grieving widow. I stopped grieving Thomas the day I discovered what he truly was. Now I'm simply trying to survive his legacy. She stood, smoothing her skirts. I'll have Mrs. Hartley prepare a room for you. We can begin work in the library after dinner. I've been keeping all the decoded documents there, along with the ones I haven't yet cracked. As she moved to leave, he called after her. Mrs. Vale? She turned back. Thank you for sharing this with me. You could have kept it hidden, used it for your own purposes. What purposes would those be? I have no skill in blackmail or manipulation. I'm a widow trying to understand why her life imploded. She met his gaze. Besides, Your Grace, I learned something during my years with Thomas. Secrets kept in darkness only grow more poisonous. Whatever we uncover, at least we'll face it in the light. He watched her go, this woman who had somehow become his unlikely ally. When he had ridden through those iron gates just over a week ago, he had expected to find a cowering widow, desperate and defeated. Instead, he had found Lysandra Vale, intelligent, courageous, and as determined as he was to uncover the truth. It was dangerous, this partnership they were forming, not just because of the enemies they might make, but because of the way she made him feel, present, alive, interested in something beyond his anger and grief. He could not afford such feelings. He certainly could not afford them for Thomas Vale's widow. Yet as he followed the elderly servant up to the rooms being prepared for him, he found himself anticipating the evening ahead with something very close to eagerness. They would work together, decode Thomas's secrets, pursue justice for those who had been wronged. It was a purpose, and he had been without purpose for so long that even this dark quest felt like renewal. The room Lysandra had given him was in the east wing, spacious but clearly unused for some time. The furniture was draped in cloth, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. But it was clean enough, and the bed looked solid. He sent for his belongings from the inn where he had been staying and began to settle in, all the while aware that somewhere below him, Lysandra was likely returning to her work, bent over those papers that might unlock everything. Dinner that evening was a modest affair served in the small dining room rather than the grand one that must have hosted Thomas's parties in better days. Just the two of them, the elderly servant hovering anxiously as though expecting them to comment on the simple fare. But the soup was hot and well seasoned, the bread fresh enough, and Evander found he had little interest in the food anyway. His attention was on Lysandra, on the way candlelight caught in her dark hair, on the quick intelligence that animated her features when she spoke. They talked of neutral things at first, the house, its history, the family that had built it generations ago. But gradually the conversation deepened, grew more personal. She told him about her childhood, the modest vicarage where she had grown up, her father's unsuccessful attempts to provide for his growing family. He found himself sharing memories of Catherine before her ruin, the bright spirit she had been, the darkness that had settled over her afterward. "Do you ever see her?" Lysandra asked gently. "Rarely. She doesn't encourage visits. I think—" He paused, struggling with the admission. "I think she blames me for not protecting her. You were away, you couldn't have known what Thomas would do. I should have known. I should have seen through his charm, recognized the predator beneath." The old guilt rose in him, familiar as a scar. I was her guardian. Her protection was my responsibility. Thomas was skilled at deception, Your Grace. He fooled me for 7 years, and I lived with him. Do not blame yourself for his cruelty. Her words were meant to comfort, but they only highlighted what he had known from the beginning. They were both victims of the same man's malice, bound together by shared suffering. It should have made her easier to hate this connection. Instead, it made her impossible to dismiss. After dinner, they retired to the library, and Lysandra showed him the full extent of her work. The room was chaos in a way that spoke of desperate intelligence, papers everywhere, books pulled from shelves and left open, charts and timelines pinned to the walls. She had been methodical in her investigation, organizing what she found by date and subject, color-coding different types of information. "You've been thorough," he said, genuinely impressed. "I've been desperate," she corrected. "Desperation breeds focus." She moved to the largest chart on the wall, one that showed connections between various names and events. "I believe Thomas was working with at least 4 others in this conspiracy. I've identified 2 of them from the papers, Lord Ashford and Sir Geoffrey Rains. Both have financial difficulties that would explain their willingness to engage in fraud. The other 2 are still hidden behind code names Thomas used." Evander studied the chart, his mind racing. "Ashford, I know. He lost heavily in the mining speculation that ruined several families. Rains I've heard of but never met. Who else?" "That's what I need you to help me determine. Thomas refers to someone as the Cardinal in multiple letters. This person seems to be the architect of the entire scheme, the one giving orders to the others. And there's one more, someone Thomas called the Surgeon. That person handled what Thomas described as delicate removals." "Removals?" Evander felt ice in his veins. "You mean... I think the surgeon was responsible for making problems disappear. People who knew too much, who threatened to expose the conspiracy. It's possible Thomas became such a problem." She pointed to a letter dated just days before Thomas's death. "This one suggests he was growing reckless, that he wanted out. The Cardinal denies his request. 2 days later, Thomas is dead." They worked late into the night, Evander using his knowledge of London society to add context to the names that appeared in the papers, Lysandra matching his insights to the coded references in Thomas's letters. Slowly, a picture emerged of a conspiracy that had been operating for years, manipulating markets and ruining families to enrich a select few. The Draymore family had been just one target among many. Catherine's seduction merely a means to gather information about investments and movements. "It's monstrous," Lysandra whispered at one point, staring at the timeline they had built. All these lives destroyed, and for what? Money they didn't need? Power they already had? Welcome to the ugliest truth about society, Mrs. Vale. Those who have the most are often the most desperate to acquire more. He rubbed his eyes, weary from hours of reading by lamplight. We should stop for tonight. Your eyes look as tired as mine feel. She nodded, though reluctance showed in her face. He understood it, the compulsion to push forward, to uncover just one more piece of the puzzle before rest. But exhaustion made people careless, and they could not afford carelessness now. As they prepared to extinguish the lamps, his hand brushed hers, reaching for the same one. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent awareness sparking through him like electricity. "Forgive me," he said, withdrawing quickly. "There's nothing to forgive." But her voice was softer, uncertain in a way it had not been before. Their eyes met in the lamplight, and for a moment the air between them felt charged with something neither could name. Then she turned away, breaking the spell. "Good night, Your Grace." "Evander," he said impulsively, "if we're to work together like this, you should call me Evander." She looked back, surprise evident in her expression. That would be highly improper. So is a widow and a duke living under the same roof while investigating a conspiracy. I believe we've moved beyond propriety, don't you think? A smile touched her lips, the first genuine one he had seen from her. It transformed her face, softened the sharp edges worry had carved there. "Very well, Evander. And you should call me Lysandra, though I warn you it's a terribly pretentious name for a vicar's daughter." "I think it suits you," he said, and meant it. Lysandra, a name from ancient stories, belonging to women of strength and sorrow. Yes, it suited her perfectly. They parted then, each to their separate rooms, but Evander found sleep elusive. His mind churned with the information they had uncovered, but beneath that analytical activity ran a current of something else. Awareness of the woman sleeping somewhere in this same house, the widow who had become his ally, who looked at him without fear, despite his fearsome reputation. It was dangerous, this growing fascination. It complicated everything. Yet he could not seem to stop his thoughts from returning to her, to the way determination burned in her dark eyes, to the grace with which she bore her suffering. The next weeks fell into a pattern that felt both natural and forbidden. They worked together daily, sometimes from dawn until late evening, mapping the conspiracy that had cost them both so much. Evander used his connections to gather information about the men they had identified, while Lysandra continued her painstaking work decoding Thomas's papers. Between them, the picture grew clearer and more damning. Lord Ashford, they discovered, had been the public face of several fraudulent investment schemes. Sir Geoffrey Rains had specialized in forgery, creating false documents that gave the schemes an air of legitimacy. The surgeon, whose real identity they still sought, handled anyone who became inconvenient. And the cardinal, the mysterious architect of it all, remained frustratingly hidden behind layers of careful obscurity. But the investigation was only part of their days. There were also moments of unexpected domesticity. Shared meals where conversation ranged far beyond conspiracy and debt, walks through the overgrown gardens where Lysandra pointed out plants struggling to survive, and Evander found himself actually caring about her plans to restore them. She showed him the portrait gallery, telling him stories of Vale ancestors with a mixture of irony and affection that suggested she had made peace with being part of their line, even through marriage to a man she had not loved. He told her about his estate in the north, the responsibilities that weighed on him, the loneliness of being feared rather than known. She listened without judgment, asked questions that showed she understood the burden of position, the way duty could become a cage. They were, he realized, becoming friends, something he had not anticipated and did not quite know how to navigate. He had allies, business associates, family members. But friends? Those had been in short supply since Catherine's ruin had made him bitter and withdrawn. One afternoon, returning from a ride where he had gone to clear his head, Evander found Lysandra in the garden with her hands deep in soil, coaxing life back into a rosebush that looked beyond saving. She wore an old dress for the work, her hair coming loose from its pins, dirt smudged on her cheek. She looked nothing like the dignified widow who had first faced him in the drawing room, and everything like someone at peace with themselves despite their circumstances. "That plant is dead," he observed, dismounting and approaching her. "No, it isn't. Look, there's green here under all this dead wood. It just needs someone to believe in it enough to help it survive." She glanced up at him, squinting against the afternoon sun. "Rather like people, don't you think?" "I think you're an optimist, despite evidence to the contrary. And I think you're a pessimist, despite wanting to be proved wrong." She returned her attention to the rose, carefully pruning away the dead branches. "Tell me something, Evander. When you came here, you intended to destroy me. What changed?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. He considered deflecting, maintaining the emotional distance that had served him well for years, but something about her honesty demanded his own. "You weren't what I expected. Thomas was a monster, and I assumed you were either complicit in his schemes or too weak to matter. You proved to be neither. Is that all?" "No." He moved closer, watching her work. "You reminded me that revenge is a hollow prize. I wanted to hurt someone for what was done to Catherine, but hurting you wouldn't change what happened to her. It would only add to the sum of suffering in the world." Lysandra sat back on her heels, looking up at him with those dark, thoughtful eyes. "You still love her very much, your sister?" "She's all the family I have left. Our parents died when I was 23, leaving me to care for a 15-year-old girl. I failed her. You didn't fail her. Thomas failed her. The men who paid him to gather information about her failed her. A society that punishes women for men's cruelty failed her. You did your best with impossible circumstances." She rose, brushing dirt from her skirts. "Have you written to her? Since you've been here?" He nodded. "I've told her about the investigation, about what we've discovered. I thought she deserved to know that we're seeking justice." "Has she responded?" "Not yet. But Catherine takes her time with correspondence. She's cautious now, about everything." Lysandra reached out, a gesture so natural he didn't think she realized she was doing it until her hand rested on his arm. "When we uncover the truth of all this, when we've identified everyone involved, I think you should go to her. Tell her in person. Let her see that you never stopped fighting for her." The touch of her hand, even through his coat sleeve, sent warmth spreading through him. He knew he should step away, maintain the proper distance between them. Instead, he found himself covering her hand with his own. "Come with me." She blinked, startled. "What?" "When this is over, come with me to Scotland. Help me tell Catherine. I think—" He paused, trying to articulate something he barely understood himself. "I think it would help her to meet you, to see that Thomas's poison didn't ruin everyone it touched." "I don't know if that's wise. I don't care if it's wise. I care if it's right, and this feels right." He realized he was still holding her hand, that they were standing very close in the garden while the afternoon sun painted everything gold. "Lysandra, Your Grace, Mrs. Vale." The elderly servant's voice carried across the garden, urgent and worried. They sprang apart like guilty children, and Evander felt a rush of frustration at the interruption. "There's someone at the door, a gentleman from London. Says he must speak with His Grace immediately on a matter of urgency." Evander and Lysandra exchanged glances, and he saw his own concern reflected in her face. No one knew he was here except his most trusted servants, and he had left instructions not to be disturbed except for emergencies. "Show him to the drawing room. I'll be there shortly." As the servant hurried away, Lysandra touched his arm again, this time in warning. "Be careful. If word has reached London about what we're investigating, then we're closer to the truth than we realized, which means we're also closer to danger." He wanted to tell her to stay in the house, to keep safe, but he knew her well enough now to understand she would not appreciate such protection. "Come, let's see what this is about together." The man waiting in the drawing room was familiar, James Whitmore, Evander's secretary, and one of the few people he trusted implicitly. But James's face was grave, his usual composure shaken. Your Grace, Mrs. Vale. Forgive the intrusion, but there's been a development you need to know about immediately. What is it? James pulled out a newspaper, that morning's edition from London, and handed it to Evander. The headline made his blood run cold. Suspicious death investigated. Lord Ashford found dead in his study. The article went on to describe how Lord Ashford had apparently taken his own life after financial ruin, leaving behind debts and disgraced connections. That's not suicide, Lysandra said quietly, reading over Evander's shoulder. That's the surgeon. Who? James looked between them, confused. Never mind, Evander said quickly. James, has there been any indication that anyone knows I've been here? That I've been investigating Thomas Vale's dealings? Not that I'm aware of, Your Grace, but I thought you should know about Ashford immediately. He was connected to... James glanced at Lysandra uncertainly. She knows everything. Speak freely. He was connected to the same investment schemes that affected your family. His death, whether suicide or murder, eliminates one of the key witnesses to what happened. Lysandra moved to the window, her mind clearly racing. The Cardinal is cleaning house. Ashford must have become a liability, just like Thomas did. Which means anyone else involved in the conspiracy is now in danger, Evander finished, including Sir Geoffrey Rains. And possibly including you, Mrs. Vale, James added soberly. If whoever is behind this learns that you've been investigating your late husband's papers, then I'm already a target. Lysandra's voice was steady, but Evander could see the fear she was trying to hide. We need to move faster. If they're eliminating witnesses, we may not have much time before the trail goes completely cold. Evander made a decision. James, I need you to do something for me. Find Sir Geoffrey Rains and bring him here. Tell him his life is in danger, that I can offer him protection if he's willing to talk. Don't let him refuse. Your Grace, kidnapping a knight of the realm is preferable to attending his funeral. Do whatever is necessary, but bring him here alive. He turned to Lysandra. We need to prepare. If the Cardinal learns Rains has come here, they may try to reach him. This house needs to be secured. Over the next hours, the peaceful estate transformed into something more like a fortress. Evander brought in trusted men from his own household, positioned them at strategic points around the property. He and Lysandra moved all the sensitive documents to a single room that could be locked and guarded. They worked side by side, and he was intensely aware of her presence, of the danger she was now in because of their investigation. You should leave, he told her at one point. Go somewhere safe until this is resolved. Where would be safer than here with you? She looked up from the papers she was organizing. Besides, I'm the only one who can decode Thomas's system quickly. You need me. I don't want to need you in danger. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning beyond their surface. Lysandra set down the papers she was holding and moved closer to him. Evander, I stopped being safe the day I married Thomas Vale. At least now, for the first time in my life, I'm fighting back instead of simply enduring. Don't ask me to give that up. He wanted to argue, to insist on protecting her, but he understood what she meant because he felt it too, the fierce satisfaction of pursuing justice instead of nursing helpless anger. So instead of arguing, he simply nodded and returned to their work, though part of his attention never left her. 2 days later, James returned with Sir Geoffrey Rains, who looked exactly like a man who knew death was stalking him. Pale, twitching, jumping at every sound, Rains was a shadow of the confident gentleman Evander had occasionally encountered in society. James had apparently found him in the process of fleeing London and had been very persuasive about the merits of seeking the Duke of Blackridge's protection. They installed Rains in a secure room and let him settle his nerves with brandy before beginning the interrogation. Evander wanted to press immediately, but Lysandra counseled patience. He's terrified. Pushing him will only make him more defensive. Let him understand that cooperation is his best chance of survival. She was right, of course. When they finally sat down with Rains that evening, the man was ready to talk, desperate to unburden himself of secrets that had become too heavy to carry. I never meant for it to go this far, he began, his hands shaking around his glass. It was supposed to be simple, manipulate a few investments, make some money, No one's seriously hurt. But people were seriously hurt, Lysandra said, her voice hard. Lives were ruined. The Duke's sister was destroyed. My husband is dead. Rains flinched. Thomas's death wasn't part of the plan. He panicked, threatened to expose everything. The Cardinal couldn't allow that. Who is the Cardinal? Evander demanded. But Rains shook his head frantically. I don't know. None of us knew. We received instructions through intermediaries, payments delivered in unmarked envelopes. The whole point was that we couldn't betray what we didn't know. The surgeon, then. Who handles the removals? I never met them either. When someone became a problem, we would simply be told they'd been dealt with. I swear, I thought it just meant they'd been paid off or frightened into silence. I didn't realize people were actually being killed until Ashford. His voice broke. Until I heard about Ashford and understood what suicide really meant. Lysandra leaned forward. But you must know something. Some detail about how the conspiracy operated, how communication happened, where the money went. Rains was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with himself. Finally, he spoke. There's a bank in the city. They handle all the transfers, all the accounts where the profits were hidden. The manager there, Cornelius Webb, he knows everything. He's the one who moves the money around, makes it impossible to trace. If you want to find the Cardinal, Webb is your best chance. It was the breakthrough they needed, and Evander felt a surge of dark satisfaction. They had a target now, a concrete next step, but it also meant going to London, leaving the relative safety of the estate. It meant putting Lysandra in even more danger. As if reading his thoughts, she spoke up. We go together. Don't even think about trying to leave me behind. Lysandra. Evander. She met his eyes steadily. Together. That was our agreement. He wanted to protest, to wrap her in safety and face the danger alone. But he also knew that she had earned the right to see this through, that her intelligence and courage had brought them this far. So he nodded, though the decision sat heavy in his chest. Together, he agreed. They left for London the next morning, a small party consisting of Evander, Lysandra, James, and several trusted guards. Rains they left behind under heavy protection, insurance against whatever might come. The journey took 2 days, and Evander used the time to plan their approach to Webb. They couldn't simply demand information. The bank manager would refuse, and they had no legal authority to compel him. They needed leverage, something that would make him talk. We have the documents, Lysandra pointed out during a stop to change horses. Thomas's papers that show years of illegal transactions. Surely Webb wouldn't want those becoming public. That might work if we weren't dealing with people who kill to protect their secrets. Webb knows that cooperation with us might mean his death. Evander paced along the road, thinking, we need to make him more afraid of the Cardinal than of us. We need him to believe that his only chance of survival is to help expose the whole conspiracy before it's exposed without him. It was a dangerous game they were proposing, one that required perfect timing and nerve, but it was also perhaps their only chance. When they reached London, Evander established Lysandra in a discreet townhouse he owned, one that was secure but not associated with his main residence. They couldn't risk the Cardinal learning of her presence in the city before they were ready. Over the next days, they watched Webb, learned his patterns, identified his vulnerabilities. The bank manager was a careful man, but careful men had routines, and routines could be exploited. They waited until he took his usual evening walk through the park. Then Evander arranged to accidentally encounter him. Mr. Webb. What a pleasant surprise. Webb froze, recognition and fear warring in his expression. Your Grace, I wasn't expecting to see you in London. No, I imagine you weren't. Walk with me. We have matters to discuss. It wasn't a request, and Webb understood that. He fell into step beside Evander, every line of his body tense. I've been investigating some interesting financial irregularities, Webb. Accounts that move money in circles, investments that consistently fail for some families while enriching others, all transactions that pass through your bank. I don't know what you're talking about, Your Grace. Of course you don't. Just as you didn't know that Lord Ashford was about to expose the whole scheme before he so conveniently committed suicide. Evander stopped walking, turning to face Webb directly. "You're intelligent enough to recognize a pattern, aren't you? First, Thomas Vale dies in a convenient accident. Then Ashford kills himself at the exact moment he becomes a liability. Who do you think is next on that list, Webb? Who's the next person who knows too much to be allowed to live?" The blood drained from Webb's face. "They wouldn't. I've been loyal. I've done everything they asked." So had Ashford. So had Thomas Vale. Loyalty buys you nothing with people like this except a delayed execution. Evander let that sink in, watched Webb's fear crystallize into understanding. "But I'm offering you something different. Protection. A chance to survive this. All you have to do is tell me who the Cardinal is." "They'll kill me if I talk to you." "They'll kill you anyway, eventually. At least if you cooperate with me, you'll live long enough to see justice done." Evander softened his voice, made it almost gentle. "I have no quarrel with you, Webb. You're a tool, nothing more. But the Cardinal, they destroyed my sister, ruined countless families, murdered people who trusted them. I want them exposed and punished. Help me do that, and I'll see you protected and relocated somewhere far from London, with enough money to start fresh." He could see Webb wavering, temptation and terror pulling him in different directions. Finally, the bank manager spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need assurances. Proof that you can protect me. You'll have it. Come to this address tomorrow night." Evander handed him a card with the location of the townhouse. "Bring whatever records you've kept, whatever evidence you have. We'll discuss the full arrangement then." It was risky inviting Webb to where Lysandra was staying, but they needed him to feel secure enough to bring the documents they required. Evander spent the next day ensuring every possible precaution was in place. Guards positioned around the property, escape routes identified, weapons within reach. Lysandra watched these preparations with a mixture of anxiety and determination. "What if he brings the Cardinal's men instead of evidence?" she asked. "Then we'll deal with them. But I don't think he will. Webb is too frightened now, too aware that his usefulness is expiring. He'll come alone, desperate for the lifeline we're offering." Evander checked his pistol one more time, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "When he arrives, stay in the background. Let me handle the initial conversation. Because I'm a woman, and therefore too delicate for such matters." He looked at her, this woman who had faced down her fears and investigated a conspiracy that had cost her everything, and smiled slightly. "Because you're too valuable to risk. If something goes wrong, if this turns into a trap, I need you safe enough to finish what we started." "That's a slightly better reason," she conceded. Then, impulsively, she crossed to him and placed her hand over his where it rested on the pistol. "Evander, if things do go wrong tonight, they won't. But if they do, I want you to know that these last weeks have been meaningful. For all the danger and difficulty, I felt more alive working with you than I did in years of safe, respectable widowhood." He turned his hand to clasp hers, feeling the delicate bones of her fingers, the warmth of her skin. "Lysandra, What could he say? That she had become important to him in ways he didn't fully understand. That the thought of her in danger made his chest tight with a fear more profound than anything he had felt for himself. That somewhere in the midst of seeking justice for the past, he had found himself hoping for a future that included her. The words wouldn't come, or perhaps he simply lacked the courage to speak them. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture that was both courtly and intimate. "Whatever happens tonight, know that I don't regret this. Any of this." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and restrained longing. Then footsteps sounded from the entrance hall, James announcing that the perimeter was secure and all was ready. They separated, returning to their roles, though something had shifted between them that could not be easily shifted back. Webb arrived precisely at the appointed hour, alone as Evander had predicted, clutching a leather case to his chest like a shield. He was ushered into the study where Evander waited, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, cataloguing exits and shadows where guards might be hiding. "You came," Evander said calmly. "That was wise. I want your word, Your Grace. Your word as a gentleman that if I cooperate fully, you'll see me protected and provided for." "You have it. Now what have you brought me?" Webb opened the case with shaking hands, revealing ledgers and papers that documented years of illegal transactions. "Everything," he said hoarsely. "Every account, every transfer, every payment, it's all here. The whole conspiracy laid out in numbers." Evander gestured to the table, and Webb began to lay out the documents, explaining each one with the detailed knowledge of someone who had processed every transaction personally. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Dozens of noble families had been targeted. Hundreds of thousands of pounds had been stolen, all funneled through a complex network of accounts designed to obscure the final destination. "And the cardinal?" Evander pressed. "Where does the money ultimately go?" Webb hesitated, then pulled out one final paper. "There. That's the master account, the one that receives the lion's share of all profits. The account holder's name is—" A sound from the window, glass breaking, a shout from outside. Evander spun toward the noise just as the door burst open and armed men flooded into the room. Webb screamed, scrambling backward as the intruders advanced. Evander reached for his pistol, but there were too many of them, and they moved with the precision of professionals. "Get down!" he shouted, hoping Lysandra would hear and hide. But even as he fought, taking down one attacker and grappling with another, he knew this had been a trap. Webb had been followed, or worse, had betrayed them. The Cardinal's forces had found them. Through the chaos, he saw Lysandra appear in the doorway, saw her eyes widen in horror at the violence unfolding. "Run!" he roared at her, but she didn't run. Instead, she grabbed a heavy candlestick from the hall table and brought it down on the head of the man nearest to her. The attacker crumpled, and she grabbed his fallen weapon, a knife that looked too large for her hands. "I told you," she said breathlessly. "We're in this together." There was no time to argue, no time to do anything but fight. The study became a battlefield, and Evander fought with the desperate ferocity of a man protecting something precious. His guards burst in from their positions outside, evening the odds, and gradually they gained the upper hand. Bodies littered the floor, some unconscious, some worse, and in the corner, forgotten in the violence, Webb cowered with his precious documents scattered around him. When the last attacker fell, silence rushed in like a wave. Evander's ears rang, his knuckles bled, and his breath came hard. But he was alive. Lysandra was alive. And Webb, terrified but unharmed, still had the information they needed. "Who sent them?" Evander demanded, advancing on the bank manager. "Who knew you were coming here?" "I don't know. I swear I don't know. I came alone. I told no one." "Then they were watching you, waiting for you to make contact with us." Evander thought rapidly. "Which means the Cardinal knows we're investigating, knows we're close, we're out of time." Lysandra, still gripping the knife though her hands shook, moved to gather the scattered documents. "Then we finish this now, tonight. Webb, you said you had the name of the account holder. Tell us." Webb looked between them, saw the determination in their faces, and seemed to make a decision. "Lady Margaret Ashford," he said, "Lord Ashford's widow. She's the Cardinal." The name landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of implication outward. Lady Margaret Ashford, known throughout society as a charitable woman, devoted to her late husband's memory, beloved for her grace and good works. She was the Cardinal. She was the architect of all this suffering. "She used her husband," Lysandra breathed, understanding dawning. "Let him be the visible face of the schemes while she pulled the strings from behind, and when he became a liability. She had him killed and played the grieving widow," Evander finished. "It's brilliant in its cruelty. No one would ever suspect her." "We need proof," James said, appearing in the doorway with several guards. "Documents alone won't be enough. The word of a frightened bank manager and a duke with a personal vendetta won't move the authorities against someone of Lady Ashford's standing." He was right, and they all knew it. They needed something incontrovertible, something that would force even Lady Ashford's most devoted admirers to see the truth. And suddenly, Evander knew what that was. "The surgeon," he said, "Lady Ashford's personal physician, Dr. Marcus Thorne. He's been with the Ashford family for decades, completely devoted to her. He's the surgeon. He handles the removals at her direction." Lysandra's face went pale. Thomas's death. The broken neck from a fall from a horse. That's exactly the kind of death that could be either accident or murder, depending on whether someone tampered with the saddle or startled the horse. And Dr. Thorne attended Thomas in his final moments, signed the death certificate declaring it an accident. Evander's mind raced. If we can find evidence linking Thorne to the murders, we can trace that back to Lady Ashford. They worked through the night, Webb providing details about payments made to Dr. Thorne, Evander's men searching for records of the doctor's movements around the times of suspicious deaths. Lysandra decoded more of Thomas's papers, finding references to medical consultations that now took on sinister meaning. Slowly, inexorably, they built their case. As dawn broke over London, they had enough. Enough to bring to the magistrate, enough to force an investigation, enough to finally bring Lady Margaret Ashford's empire of corruption crashing down. Evander sent James to arrange a meeting with authorities he trusted, men who would not be swayed by Lady Ashford's influence or wealth. Left alone in the study with Lysandra, surrounded by the evidence of their long investigation, Evander finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. Justice for Catherine, for all the Cardinal's victims, was within reach. The debt that had brought him to Lysandra's door would be paid not in money, but in truth revealed and villainy exposed. "It's almost over," Lysandra said softly, voicing his thoughts. She stood at the window, watching the sunrise paint London in shades of gold and rose. "After today, we'll have no more reason to work together." The words should have brought relief. Instead, they filled him with unexpected loss. "Lysandra," he began, then found he didn't know how to continue. How did he explain that somewhere in the midst of seeking revenge, he had found something he hadn't known he needed? That this woman, who by all rights should have been his enemy, had become essential to him in ways that defied explanation. She turned from the window, and in the gentle morning light he saw her clearly, not as Thomas Vale's widow, not as a victim or an ally, but as herself. Lysandra, who had faced her fears and refused to be broken by them. Lysandra, who had matched his determination with her own and never once asked him to protect her from the consequences of truth-seeking. Lysandra, who looked at him now with eyes that held question and hope and carefully guarded vulnerability. "After this is over," he said, choosing his words with care, "the debt between us will be settled. You'll be free of any obligation to me." "I understand. But perhaps—" He moved closer, drawn by something he could no longer deny. "Perhaps we might find a new arrangement, one built not on debt but on choice." Her breath caught. "What sort of arrangement? The kind where I court you properly, where I ask permission to call on you, to take you driving in the park, to generally make a fool of myself trying to win your regard." He reached out, gently touching her cheek. "I know it's too soon. I know society will gossip. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is unwise. But Lysandra, these weeks with you have shown me that I've been half alive for years, existing but not truly living. You make me want to try again." Tears gathered in her eyes, though she was smiling. "You already have my regard, you impossible man. You've had it since the day you agreed to search for truth with me instead of simply taking your revenge. I thought—" She paused, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "I thought I would spend my life alone, that Thomas had poisoned any chance I had at happiness. But then you came through those iron gates, and everything changed." He kissed her then, unable to hold back any longer. It was gentle at first, questioning, giving her every chance to refuse, but she didn't refuse. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him back, her hands coming up to frame his face, and suddenly gentle became fierce, became hungry, became a promise of everything they might build together once the shadows of the past were finally laid to rest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evander rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize for that." "Don't you dare," she said. "I've been wondering for weeks what it would be like to kiss you. Only wondering. I've been actively restraining myself from finding out. Then perhaps we should stop restraining ourselves quite so much." She kissed him again, brief and sweet. "After we finish this, after Lady Ashford is exposed and justice is served, then we'll have all the time in the world to discover what we might be to each other." It was a promise, and he held it close as they prepared for the day ahead. James returned with news that the magistrate would see them that morning, that he had assembled several other officials who could not be influenced by Lady Ashford's wealth or position. They gathered their evidence, organized their testimony, and prepared to finally end the conspiracy that had cost so many people so much. The confrontation, when it came, was anticlimactic in some ways and devastating in others. Faced with overwhelming evidence, with Webb's testimony and the documents that laid bare years of fraud and murder, Lady Ashford's composure cracked. She raged, she wept, she denied. But denial meant nothing against proof, and the authorities were thorough. Dr. Thorne was arrested, and under interrogation he confirmed everything, how Lady Ashford had directed him to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose her schemes, how he had tampered with Thomas Vale's saddle and startled his horse, how he had poisoned Lord Ashford when the man grew too unstable to trust. It was over. The conspiracy was exposed, the conspirators arrested, justice set in motion. Evander felt a weight lift from his chest that he had carried for so long he had forgotten what it was like to breathe freely. That same afternoon, he sent an express letter to Catherine in Scotland, telling her everything, asking if he might visit and bring someone special to meet her. The response came faster than he expected, and when he opened it, he found not the formal acknowledgement he had anticipated, but a letter in Catherine's own hand, trembling but warm. She had written that she would be honoured to meet the woman who had helped bring Thomas Vale's co-conspirators to justice, that perhaps it was time she stopped hiding from the world. There was something in her words that suggested healing might finally be possible, that the wounds inflicted so long ago might at last begin to close. Evander shared the letter with Lysandra, who read it with tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's willing to see me, even knowing I was married to him. You're not responsible for his actions any more than she was. I think Catherine understands that better than anyone." He pulled Lysandra into his arms, holding her while she cried, not from sorrow this time, but from relief and hope. "Will you come with me to Scotland? Will you meet her?" "Of course I will. I want to meet the woman whose suffering started all of this, whose pain led to justice for so many others. I want to tell her I'm sorry for what my husband did, even though I know sorry will never be enough." They made plans to leave within the week, as soon as the legal proceedings against Lady Ashford and Dr. Thorne were well underway. Webb was placed under protection, as he had been promised, given a new identity and passage to America, where he could start fresh, far from the reach of anyone who might seek revenge. Sir Geoffrey Rains was released from his protective custody, a broken man who would live out his days in obscurity, haunted by the part he had played. The scandal that erupted when Lady Ashford's crimes became public was spectacular, even by London standards. The Ton could speak of nothing else, how the charitable widow had been a monster in disguise, how she had orchestrated years of fraud and multiple murders, how only the Duke of Blackridge's investigation had exposed her. Some whispered about Evander's methods, questioned his involvement with Thomas Vale's widow, suggested impropriety, but these voices were drowned out by those praising his persistence, his dedication to justice, his refusal to let the powerful escape consequences. For Lysandra, the revelation was both vindication and pain. She had not been wrong about Thomas, had not been a fool for suspecting darkness in him, but knowing the full extent of his crimes, understanding that she had shared a home and a life with a man capable of such evil, left scars that would take time to heal. Evander was patient with her grief, understanding that justice and closure were not the same thing, that even when wrongs were righted, the pain of them lingered. The night before they were to leave for Scotland, they dined together in the townhouse, just the two of them in quiet intimacy. Lysandra wore a new dress, the first she had purchased in years, deep blue silk that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes. Evander couldn't look away from her, this woman who had transformed from adversary to ally to something far more precious in the span of mere weeks. "I've been thinking about the Vale estate," he said over dessert. "With Thomas's debts settled through the seizure of Lady Ashford's assets, the property reverts to you free and clear. What will you do with it?" Lysandra considered this, swirling wine in her glass. "I thought about selling it, starting fresh somewhere new, but the more I consider it, the more I think I'd like to restore it, make it into something beautiful again, something that serves a good purpose. Perhaps a school for girls who need education but lack the means, a place where they can learn to be independent, to think for themselves, to never be trapped by circumstances the way I was. That's a remarkable idea. It's a dream, nothing more. I have no idea how to establish such a thing, no connections or experience with— You have me, he interrupted gently. My connections, my resources, my experience. If this is what you want to do, Lysandra, I'll help you make it happen. She looked at him with such open emotion that his breath caught. Why? Why would you do all this for me? Because I love you. The words emerged easily, naturally, carrying a weight of truth that could not be denied. I think I've loved you since the day you stood in that shabby drawing room and refused to be intimidated by the fearsome Duke of Blackridge. Certainly I've loved you since you picked up a weapon and fought beside me rather than running to safety. You're remarkable, Lysandra Vale, and I want to spend whatever time I have left in this world helping you achieve every dream you've ever been brave enough to have. Tears spilled over her cheeks, but she was smiling. I love you too. I shouldn't. It's too fast, too complicated, too everything society says a widow shouldn't feel. But I do. You came into my life like a storm, and instead of destroying everything, you cleared away all the debris and showed me I was stronger than I knew. He rose from his chair and knelt beside hers, taking her hands in his. Marry me, Lysandra, not today, not even soon. I know you need time, and I'm willing to wait. But marry me eventually, when the gossip has died down, and your mourning period is properly observed, and all the proprieties have been satisfied. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making up for the fact that I once came to your door seeking to destroy you. You couldn't destroy me, she said softly, touching his face with gentle fingers. But yes, Evander, I'll marry you. When the time is right, when we've both healed from the wounds the past left on us, I'll marry you and be glad of it. They sealed the promise with a kiss that started tender and grew heated, weeks of restrained desire finally finding expression. He lifted her from her chair and carried her to the settee, where they explored this new dimension of their relationship with growing urgency. But when his hands moved to the fastenings of her dress, she stopped him with a gentle touch. Not yet, she whispered. Not while I'm still technically in mourning, not while the scandal is still fresh. I want to come to you freely, with no shadow of Thomas between us, no possibility of anyone suggesting impropriety. Can you wait a little longer? He could barely breathe for wanting her, but he understood what she was asking and why. I can wait, he promised, though it took every ounce of his considerable will. I've waited years for something real. I can wait a few more months. They held each other through the evening, talking of dreams and plans, of the school Lysandra would build and the students she would teach. Evander told her about his estates in the north, the lands he managed and the people who depended on him. They spoke of Catherine, of hopes that she might find peace and perhaps even love herself someday. They planned their future in quiet voices, building it piece by piece from the rubble of their pasts. The journey to Scotland took several days, travelling through countryside that gradually transformed from the gentle hills of England to the more rugged beauty of the Scottish borders. Lysandra watched it all with wondering eyes, having rarely travelled beyond the small radius of her father's parish and the Vale estate. Evander took pleasure in showing her new sights, in watching her face light up at unexpected vistas or charming villages they passed through. They stayed in respectable inns along the way, always maintaining proper appearances, separate rooms, a maid for Lysandra's propriety, James serving as both secretary and chaperone. But in the evenings, they would find quiet moments to steal away together, walking in inn gardens or sitting by fires in private parlours, and these moments felt more intimate than anything physical could have been. They were learning each other, discovering the small details that made up a life, how Lysandra liked her tea, how Evander's mood could be read in the set of his shoulders, the dreams they had harboured in secret and were now brave enough to share. Catherine's residence was a modest estate in the Highlands, beautiful in its isolation. As their carriage approached, Evander felt his chest tighten with anxiety. He had not seen his sister in over 2 years, their relationship maintained only through those formal, distant letters. Would she truly be ready to meet them? Had he been wrong to bring Lysandra here? But when they were ushered into the drawing room and Catherine rose from her chair to greet them, Evander felt hope bloom in his chest. She was thinner than he remembered, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of suffering. But there was also something new in her bearing, a quiet strength that reminded him powerfully of Lysandra. "Brother," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "You came. I said I would." He embraced her, feeling her tension gradually ease. "Catherine, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Lysandra Vale." The two women studied each other for a long moment, and Evander held his breath, uncertain what would pass between them. Then Lysandra stepped forward and, instead of offering a formal curtsy, reached out to take Catherine's hands in hers. "I'm so sorry," Lysandra said simply. "I know those words are inadequate, but they're all I have. I'm sorry for what Thomas Vale did to you, for the pain he caused, for the life he stole from you. If I could undo any of it, I would." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "You're not responsible for his actions." Evander explained that in his letters, how you were as much his victim as I was, how you helped expose the conspiracy that destroyed so many lives. "I wanted to meet you because—" She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Because I needed to see that it's possible to survive what he did, to keep going, to find purpose, to maybe even find happiness again." "It is possible," Lysandra assured her. "It's hard, and some days you'll feel like you're drowning in the weight of it. But you're stronger than what was done to you, Miss Draymore. I can see it in you." They sat together, the three of them, and talked late into the afternoon. Catherine spoke hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence about her time in Scotland, the loneliness and shame that had consumed her. But she also spoke of small victories, befriending the housekeeper, taking up painting, learning to find peace in solitude. She was healing slowly but surely, and meeting Lysandra seemed to accelerate that healing. Here was proof that Thomas Vale had not destroyed everything he touched, that his victims could rise above his cruelty. Over dinner that evening, Catherine even laughed, a sound Evander had thought he might never hear again. Lysandra was telling a story about her attempts to manage the Vale estate with no experience and dwindling resources, how she had once tried to help birth a lamb and ended up covered in mud and thoroughly humiliated by the shepherd, who had to rescue both her and the sheep. "You should have seen me," Lysandra said, grinning. "Convinced I could do anything with enough determination, absolutely hopeless in practice. Poor Thomas was mortified when he found out his wife had been wrestling livestock." The mention of Thomas's name caused a brief silence, but Catherine broke it with unexpected grace. "He would have been mortified by you in general, I think. You're far too vital, too real for a man who valued only appearances and control." "You're right about that," Lysandra agreed. "I was never the wife he wanted. Too curious, too stubborn, too unwilling to simply exist as ornament. I think in his way he despised me for it." "Then he was an even greater fool than I thought," Evander said quietly. "Your curiosity and stubborn determination are what brought his crimes to light. They're your greatest strengths." The look Lysandra gave him across the table made Catherine smile knowingly. "So," she said, addressing her brother with an arched eyebrow that reminded him of the spirited girl she had once been, "are you going to tell me what's really happening between you two, or do I have to guess?" Evander felt heat rise in his face, a rare occurrence. "Lysandra has agreed to marry me eventually when the time is right." "Eventually?" Catherine laughed. "Brother, you've been alone for years, punishing yourself for failing to protect me. Don't waste more time on eventually. Life is too short and happiness too rare. Your sister is wise," Lysandra said, reaching across to touch Evander's hand. "Perhaps we should reconsider our timeline." They stayed in Scotland for a fortnight, and those weeks were a revelation. Catherine grew stronger daily, her confidence returning as she spent time with Lysandra, who seemed to understand instinctively what the younger woman needed, not pity, but partnership. They rode together through the Highland valleys, walked along rocky shores, sat by the fire in the evenings talking of everything and nothing. Catherine spoke of perhaps returning to society, of reclaiming the life Thomas Vale had stolen from her. Lysandra encouraged every such thought, sharing her own struggles with rebuilding after devastation. For Evander, watching the two women he loved most in the world form a genuine friendship was a kind of healing he had not known he needed. The guilt he had carried for years began to ease. Catherine did not blame him, had never blamed him, and seeing her laugh again, seeing hope return to her eyes, gave him permission to hope as well. On their last evening in Scotland, as they prepared to return south, Catherine drew Evander aside. "Thank you," she said simply, "for never giving up on justice, for bringing Lysandra to meet me, for showing me that life can continue after terrible things. I'm going to come to London for your wedding. Whenever you have it, I'll be there. Are you certain? The gossip, let them gossip. I'm done hiding. Thomas Vale doesn't get to steal any more of my life." She smiled, and it was genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't do something ridiculous like a quiet ceremony with no celebration. You deserve joy, Evander. Stop being afraid of it." The journey back to England felt different, lighter somehow, as though they were traveling towards something rather than away from something. Lysandra dozed against Evander's shoulder in the carriage, and he held her while she slept, marveling at the turn his life had taken. He had gone to collect a debt and found something infinitely more valuable. He had sought revenge and discovered redemption instead. They returned to find London still buzzing with the scandal of Lady Ashford's crimes, but the tone had shifted. Now people spoke admiringly of the Duke of Blackridge's investigation, of how he had brought a dangerous criminal to justice, and they spoke with sympathy of Mrs. Vale, the innocent widow who had been caught up in her late husband's schemes. The gossip about impropriety between them had been drowned out by the larger story of conspiracy exposed and justice served. Lysandra returned to the Vale estate to begin the work of restoration, throwing herself into plans for the school, with the same determination she had brought to decoding Thomas's papers. Evander helped, using his connections to secure funding and support, to hire architects and teachers, to transform her dream into reality. He travelled between London and the Vale property frequently, unwilling to be apart from her for long, and gradually the servants stopped looking surprised when the Duke of Blackridge arrived unannounced to take their mistress walking in the gardens or to discuss educational curriculum over tea. 6 months after Lady Ashford's arrest, on a spring morning when the gardens Lysandra had restored were blooming with new life, Evander proposed again. Not in a drawing room or over dinner, but in the rose garden where they had first truly talked, where she had told him that dead things could bloom again if someone believed in them enough. "I'm done with eventually," he said, pulling a ring from his pocket, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that matched the blue dress she had worn the night he first told her he loved her. "Marry me, Lysandra. Marry me soon." Catherine's right. Life is too short to waste on propriety when we could be building our future together. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, immediately, as soon as it can be arranged. I'm done with eventually too." They were married 6 weeks later, in a ceremony that's scandalously cheerful for a widow's remarriage, with Catherine serving as Lysandra's attendant and half of London society in attendance. The tongue whispered, but they had whispered about worse things, and neither Evander nor Lysandra cared. They had faced down conspiracies and murderers together. They could certainly face down gossip. The wedding breakfast was held at the Vale estate, now transformed into a beautiful property once more. Its gardens thriving, its halls filled with light and laughter. Students had already been enrolled in the school Lysandra was establishing, young women who would receive the education and independence she had been denied. It was a new beginning, built from the ashes of old suffering, and as Evander watched his bride move among their guests, radiant with happiness, he understood that this was what justice truly looked like, not just punishment for the guilty, but healing and hope for those who survived. That night, finally alone in the master suite that had been redecorated to erase all traces of Thomas Vale, Evander made love to his wife with the reverence of a man who had thought himself incapable of such feeling. She came to him without reservation, without shame, giving herself with the same courage she had shown in everything else, and afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled of lavender and possibility, they spoke of the future they would build together. "I want children," Lysandra said softly, tracing patterns on his chest. "I want to fill this house with laughter and love, to create something beautiful to replace all the ugliness that came before. Then we'll have children. As many as you want, as loud and troublesome as they can be." He kissed her forehead. "Though I warn you, they'll probably inherit your stubbornness." And your tendency toward dramatic gestures. Can you imagine? We'll raise a house full of tiny, determined people who refuse to accept injustice and charge headlong into danger to right wrongs. Terrifying, he agreed, smiling. Perfect. They built that life together over the following years, facing challenges and triumphs with equal partnership. The school flourished, producing graduates who went on to become teachers, writers, reformers, women who changed the world in small and large ways. Catherine did return to society, and with Lysandra's support, she even eventually found love herself, marrying a kind Scottish lord who valued her strength rather than fearing it. The debt that had brought Evander to Lysandra's door became a story they told at dinner parties, laughing about how the Duke of Blackridge had come to ruin the widow Vale and ended up ruined himself instead, ruined for any life that didn't include her. It became their founding myth, the dark beginning that had led to everything bright that followed. And sometimes on quiet evenings when their children were asleep and the house was peaceful, Evander and Lysandra would walk through the gardens she had restored, hand in hand, marveling at the strange paths life took. He had sought revenge and found love. She had expected destruction and discovered partnership. Together, they had taken the worst thing that ever happened to them and transformed it into the best thing that ever could. The debt had been paid not in money, but in something far more valuable, in truth revealed, in justice served, in lives rebuilt and futures reclaimed. And in the end, the only debt that remained was the one they owed to each other, for having the courage to look past old wounds and see the possibility of healing, for refusing to let hatred and fear win, for choosing again and again to love, despite every reason to guard their hearts. It was a debt they spent the rest of their lives happily paying, in moments of tenderness and passion, in children raised with love and purpose, in a partnership that proved stronger than the darkness that had tried to destroy them. The Duke had come to claim a debt and found the widow who claimed his heart, and in the claiming and being claimed, they discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as losses, and the most profound victories emerge from what first appears to be defeat. Their story became legend in its own small way, not grand enough for history books, but cherished by those who knew them, passed down through generations as proof that even the darkest beginnings could lead to the brightest endings, that love could bloom in the most unlikely soil, that courage and determination could transform tragedy into triumph. And when they were old, surrounded by children and grandchildren who bore witness to the life they had built together, Evander would still look at Lysandra with wonder, still marvel that this remarkable woman had agreed to take a chance on a man who had once been so lost in darkness he could barely see the light. She would catch him watching her and smile, that same smile she had given him in the garden all those years ago, and he would know with absolute certainty that every moment of suffering had been worth it to find his way to her. The iron gates that had groaned so ominously on his arrival now stood perpetually open, welcoming students and guests and all who sought the sanctuary Lysandra had created. The house that had been dying when he first saw it now thrived with life and purpose. And the debt that had seemed so important, that had consumed him with thoughts of revenge and recompense, had transformed into the greatest blessing of his life, because without it, he would never have met the woman who taught him that the heart's capacity for love was far greater than its capacity for hate, that healing was stronger than revenge, and that sometimes the best way to settle accounts with the past was to build a future so beautiful it made the past irrelevant. They had taken their broken pieces and made something whole. They had taken their scars and turned them into stories of survival. They had taken a debt built on suffering and paid it with joy. And in doing so, they had proved that no matter how dark the night, morning would always come, bringing with it the possibility of redemption, the promise of love, and the hope that even the most wounded hearts could learn to beat strongly again. Dies Trusti, dear listeners, we've reached the end of this emotional journey of the Duke of Blackridge and the widow Lysandra Vale, a story that began in the shadows of revenge and blossomed in the light of true love. If this narrative touched your heart, if you found yourself rooting for Evander and Lysandra, if you believe that even from the darkest ashes hope can bloom, then please help me continue bringing stories like this to you. Please subscribe to the Echoes of Romance channel. Leave your like on this video, activate notifications so you don't miss any new stories, and leave in the comments. Which part of this journey moved you the most? Was it the moment when Evander first saw Lysandra, when she took up arms to fight beside him, or perhaps that desperate kiss after the battle? Your words in the comments not only warm my heart, but also help me understand which stories resonate most deeply with you, which emotions you wish to explore in the next narratives we'll share together. Thank you for joining me on this journey through love, redemption, and courage. Until the next story, may your own hearts find the hope that Evander and Lysandra found in each other. With all my affection, echoes of romance.